One of the most common complaints we hear from clients is that their hamstrings feel chronically tight, and they often spend hours stretching their hamstrings like this and see very little progress. What might surprise you is that most people don't have tight hamstrings in a traditional sense, and that their hamstring is short and tight. So I'm going to tell you why, and most importantly, I'm going to tell you what to do instead. So first thing, to check somebody's hamstring flexibility, I'm going to have them do an active straight leg raise laying on their back to check their straight leg hip flexion range of motion. I'm going to check them both active, so I'm going to have Courtney flex her leg up as high as she can, and I want to see, can they get to 90 degrees roughly? That's pretty good hip flexion range of motion. And then I'm also going to check passively just to see if there's a difference between their active and passive range of motion. This is pretty good range of motion. And in fact, most people who complain to me of feeling hamstring tightness usually present with a pretty good leg raise. Even if someone did have limited hamstring flexibility and it looks something like this, I would still recommend ditching the classic table hamstring stretch for a different strategy. But first, let's talk a little bit about hamstring anatomy. The hamstring inserts distally at the tibia and the fibula and attaches proximally at the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis. Because of this, pelvic positioning plays a huge impact on hamstring and hip flexion flexibility. As you can see here with my purple hamstring attaching at the bottom of my pelvis, my pelvic positioning plays a huge impact on the eccentric or concentric orientation of my hamstring. If I'm anteriorly tilted and my pelvis is tilted forward, it eccentrically loads my hamstring and puts it under constant stretch, giving the sensation that it's actually short and tight. What most people think is a short and tight hamstring is actually an eccentrically loaded and constantly stretched hamstring. So constant static stretching really isn't a great solution to solve that problem. What we're going to focus on here instead is establishing trunk and pelvic strength and stability so we can better control our pelvic position and then better establish hip flexion range of motion. So let me take you through the steps I'd go through to reestablish hip flexion range of motion and hamstring flexibility. So the first thing I would do was start with some basic respiration work like the supine hook lying breathing drill. So lay down on the ground with your knees bent, feet flat on the ground, and we're going to use this as a drill to try to teach them how to use their anterior abdominals and how to manage the relationship between their rib cage and their pelvis. So I'm going to have Courtney lift her toes up and simply dig her heels in the ground so she can feel her hamstrings working. Then I want her to get a posterior tilt of her pelvis, so she's going to press her low back against the floor and just slightly tilt her pelvis up towards her. We don't want a full bridge yet, just want her to get some good alignment between those posterior pelvis and her rib cage so that she can better manage the tension in her hamstrings. Then I want her to start with a big breath in the nose, long exhale out the mouth, and think about driving her ribs down and in so she's starting to engage her obliques, her diaphragm, her pelvic floor. Long exhale, hold for a second, then inhale, fill back up. Keep that tension in the hamstrings, keep that posterior tilt. You're going to find that your clients are really start to understand how to feel their anterior abdominals and how to really feel and engage their hamstrings at the same time. Start with that, and then we're going to progress to just turning this into a bridge. So we're going to have her actively work through hip flexion and hip extension, managing that rib cage pelvic relationship. So same position that she's in here. She's simply going to take that breath first. Exhale, draw the ribs downward. As they come down, now she's going to bridge up. And we can see that she has a good relationship here. She's not overextending through her lumbar and pelvic spine. Come back down. Big breath in. Ribs down. Engage her abdominals, bridge up. So she's understanding how to manage that pelvic lumbar relationship. The next thing I would do is I would go into a leg raise progression. So I'd start with a band assisted leg lower. She's going to get this band over the arch of her foot. She's going to pull it tight to the ground. I want her to think about flexing this quad and getting her knees straight. And we're going to do that same breathing. And so what this is going to be is really an assisted stability drill. We're using the band to help keep this leg in flexion into that hip flexion position. And then she's going to exhale and progressively lower that right leg down. We want to see that this leg doesn't rotate out, the knee doesn't bend, and this leg doesn't move either. So what we're teaching her to do is maintain a stable pelvic and trunk position while she gets opposing hip flexion and hip extension. Now, as somebody makes progress, if they get up to about this angle where she's pretty well flexed up, almost 90 degrees, we're simply going to take the band away. And now they're going to typically comment, this feels much more like an ab exercise. So same thing, exhale, down. You can even see her shaking a little bit. Big breath in, exhale, extend down. We want to see that she's able to actively flex this hip up, maintaining hip flexion while she extends that opposite leg. Again, most people's limitation into hip flexion isn't actually hamstring flexibility, but pelvic stability and inability to manage that pelvic stability while the hip is moving. Additionally, I think it's useful to also work on anterior core strength in our program. So basic anti-extension. So I'm gonna have Courtney flip over into a front plank. Typically, I find as our clients get stronger with their anterior core strength, magically that hip flexion, that hamstring tightness gets better because they get better at maintaining this relationship. What we want to see is that she's able to maintain head, thoracic spine, sacrum in one nice straight line here. She's going to squeeze her glutes tight, right? Often you're going to see those same people who struggle and feel that hamstring tightness are the people who are going to plank like this in that big extension position. I want to put my hand on her back and say, push your back into my hand, and have her understand how to maintain that good alignment, that tension on the front side. Lastly, the real magic comes starting to load the client into that range of motion so we can almost hit the save button on that range of motion, the stability that we developed in the previous drills. So in the program, we want to start to include things like hip hinging, chest loaded hinge with a weight at the chest, having them really work on sitting back into the hips, then finishing strong at the top. We want to see that while they're going through that hinge, that again, they're managing that trunk and pelvic position. They're not overextending at the top. They're managing that alignment between their pelvis and rib cage, sitting back into those hips, and then finishing strong. Both bilateral hinging as well as unilateral hinging. So what I would start with is maybe a reaching single leg deadlift. So Courtney's going to stand on her right leg, reach with her left hand, and we really want to see her get deep into those hips, reach, and come up tall. From there, we could progress to something like a loaded single leg deadlift. Again, managing that pelvic position, finishing strong through the hips, nice and tall. What you'll find is as they get stronger in these hinging positions, deadlifting from the floor, whether it's a trap bar deadlift or a kettlebell deadlift, chest loaded hinge or a single leg deadlift, they're gonna really see big improvements in how their hamstrings feel and their ability to get into active hip flexion. This is gonna be a much more effective strategy than doing constant static stretching over time to improving hamstring tightness and hip flexion range of motion.